Welcome to the finale of Season 2 CSS Breakdown, book by book. In this final episode, we wrap up Roger Hopkins Burke's An Introduction to Criminological Theory with a powerful exploration of social control theories, a lens that asks not why people break the law, but why most of us choose to follow it.
That's such a fundamental, almost unsettling shift, isn't it?
It really is.
For so many deep dives we've done throughout this season, we've been laser-focused on the why crime question. We've looked at theories that try to explain motivation, strain, environmental factors, how people learn deviance.
Right.
We've been asking, in essence, what is it about certain people or certain circumstances that pushes them into crime?
Absolutely. We've dug into why some individuals might feel pressured or are influenced by their surroundings or, pick up criminal behaviors like any other skill.
Yeah.
And social control theory just walks right up to that entire conversation and says, hold on a second. Maybe that's not the right starting point. It takes deviance for granted. It assumes that, given the chance, we'd all break the rules if it benefited us. Right. The real puzzle, then, isn't why some people are criminals. It's why the vast majority of us aren't. Why do most of us conform?
It's counterintuitive, isn't it? It flips the whole problem on its head.
Totally.
Instead of looking for what's abnormal about criminals, it asks what's effectively abnormal, or perhaps more accurately, what's constrained about conformists. What are the unseen ties, the connections, the commitments that hold back that assumed natural impulse towards self-interest, even when it means breaking laws?
And that's the deep dive we're embarking on today. Using the chapter on social control theories from Roger Hopkins Burke's An Introduction to Criminological Theory as our guide, we're going to trace this truly different way of thinking.
Okay.
We'll go back to its intellectual roots, see how early thinkers grappled with this, explore the development of more formal theories, including some really influential ones. Look at how people have tried to combine this idea with other perspectives.
Right, the integration attempts.
Exactly. Then examine a theory that claimed to explain everything.
Ah, the general theory.
That's the one. And finally, weigh up the strengths and limitations of this entire approach, all based on Hopkins Burke's analysis for you, the listener.
So let's start with that core challenging premise. The fundamental assumption about human nature that underpins social control theory.
Okay, let's really lean into this. The theory starts from a place that might feel a bit cynical to some. The idea that human nature isn't inherently moral or constrained.
Right. Thinkers like Thomas Hobbes centuries ago, or even Emil Durkheim in a different context, touched on this idea that our needs, our desires, our aspirations are, by nature, unlimited.
If that's the case, why wouldn't you pursue them by the quickest means available?
That's the really provocative thought. It essentially removes the need to search for some specific criminal motivation. It suggests that breaking the law isn't necessarily a sign of some deep psychological issue or being pushed by overwhelming social forces in the way other theories might describe. Instead, it argues that law-breaking is often the most direct, most efficient way to get what you want, whether that's immediate gratification, resolving a conflict, or achieving a goal.
So if you see something you want, taking it might be faster than earning the money to buy it. If someone makes you angry, reacting violently might feel more immediate than trying to resolve it through complex social negotiation.
Exactly.
The default state, from this perspective, is seeking that gratification or resolution by the easiest means, which often involves breaking rules.
Precisely. Where many other theories see conformity as the normal state that just happens and crime as the anomaly caused by specific factors, social control theory flips that completely.
Right.
It says deviance is expected, it's natural, conformity is the anomaly, the thing we need to explain. That's the puzzle.
And the thread that ties together all the different versions of control theory, despite their variations, is this central assumption. Crime occurs when the things that are supposed to stop you from doing it, the social controls, the personal controls, are weak or simply not there.
Right. So the focus isn't on what motivates you towards crime, but on what restrains you from crime.
Okay.
It emphasizes the bonds, the commitments, the values, the norms, the beliefs that act as these restraining forces. It's about the things you have that you don't want to risk losing.
And it's important to clarify that while earlier figures like Hobbes did paint a picture of inherently amoral, self-serving individuals, later control theories aren't necessarily saying everyone is born bad.
No, not quite.
They're just rejecting the opposite assumption. The idea, sometimes seen in theories like enemy or subcultural perspectives, that individuals automatically internalize pro-social norms and values and naturally become moral simply through standard socialization processes.
Yes, they're saying that internalizing those norms and values strongly enough to consistently override the impulse towards deviance isn't automatic. It requires specific conditions.
Oh.
And because they remove that assumption of inherent or automatically acquired morality, they don't need concepts like relative deprivation, where you feel deprived compared to others, or status frustration, where you're frustrated by your place in society, to explain why someone would want to offend.
Right. The wanting is assumed.
The wanting is taken for granted. The question becomes, what are the restraining forces? And if those forces are weak, the individual is left free to make that rational calculation of costs and benefits, much like the rational actor model suggests.
It feels like this perspective has a foot in both camps, doesn't it? It assumes a kind of universal, almost rational drive for gratification, but argues that social structures are key to restraining it.
Exactly. The decision to offend becomes a rational calculation, but one that is only possible because the social brakes aren't functioning effectively.
So if this fundamental assumption is the starting point, where did these ideas actually originate? This didn't just appear out of nowhere. The source material points to some deep historical roots.
It really does. We can trace these ideas back through quite different intellectual traditions. The first, as we touched upon, comes from the rational actor tradition, going back to Thomas Hobbes in 1651.
Hobbes is famous for his work on political philosophy, thinking about the state and social order. Leviathan.
Right. His big concern was the fundamental tension between what he saw as innate human nature, competitive, self-interested, seeking power, and the necessity of legal constraint to avoid a war of all against all.
How do you get these inherently self-interested beings to follow laws? That was his question.
Exactly. And his answer was stark, wasn't it?
Yeah, fear.
It was fear. He famously stated that fear, it is the only thing that makes men keep them the laws. This is the bedrock idea of external restraint.
So people obey not because they believe in the law itself, but because
Right.
they fear the punishment or consequences imposed by external authority, like the state.
Pretty much. It's not about morality. It's about consequences.
That's a powerful, if somewhat grim, foundation for understanding conformity.
Precisely. Then, moving to a different tradition, we see roots in the predestined actor model, specifically drawing on psychological ideas, notably Sigmund Freud's work from 1927.
Freud in the unconscious mind. How does he fit into control theory? Seems like a different world.
Well, Freud's model of the personality, with the id, ego, and superego, provides a framework for understanding internal restraint.
Okay.
His idea was that inherently deviant impulses come from the id. These impulses are natural. What constrains them are the ego, which navigates reality, and especially the superego, which internalizes societal norms and morality, acting like an internal policeman.
So deviance happens when that internal policeman, the superego, isn't strong enough, or maybe wasn't developed properly.
Essentially, yes. The source mentions that early psychological control models, like those developed by researchers such as Reiss, Nye, and Reckless, drew more explicitly on these Freudian concepts, focusing on the strength or weakness of these internal psychological restraints as key to explaining why some people deviate and others don't.
Okay, so we have Hobbes's external fear, Freud's internal psychology. What's the third root?
And the third tradition is back in sociology, but still within that predestined actor idea, through Emil Durkheim in 1897.
Durkheim, right. Suicide enemy.
Exactly. Durkheim, in his work on suicide and social regulation, also talked about the limitless nature of human desires and aspirations. He argued that these are normally kept in check by socialized moral norms provided by society.
So similar starting point on desires to Hobbes, but the restraint comes from internalized social norms rather than external fear.
Yes, that's a key difference. But crucially, Durkheim also observed that in times of rapid social change or upheaval, society might fail to provide these regulating norms effectively, leading to a state of anomie or normlessness.
Right, the breakdown of norms.
And he pointed out that society itself can create needs and aspirations that are difficult or impossible to meet within the conventional social structure.
Okay, that sounds very close to Merton's strain theory, which we've covered before.
It does, and Merton certainly built on Durkheim's idea of anomie. But here's where social control theorists interpret Durkheim differently from strain theorists.
How so?
For Durkheim and Merton, anomie or social disorganization pushes people to crime by creating strain, the gap between goals and means, or lack of clear rules.
Okay.
For social control theorists drawing on Durkheim, social disorganization doesn't push you towards crime. Instead, it weakens the established social norms and controls that prevent crime, thereby making crime possible by removing the restraints.
So the disorganization is the absence of control, not the source of the urge. It's the loosening of the reins, not the spur.
Exactly. It removes the brake. It doesn't step on the accelerator. So these diverse roots, Hobbes's external fear, Freud's internal psychological constraints, and Durkheim's sociological view of socialized norms, and the weakening of those norms through disorganization, provide the foundational assumptions for the control perspective.
With those foundational ideas in place, how did researchers start building more specific sociological theories around social control?
Well, picking up on that Durkheimian thread, the idea of inadequate social control during rapid change leading to unregulated desires connects directly to the Chicago School's concept of social disorganization.
Right, Sean McKay. When neighborhoods experience instability, residential mobility, breakdown of traditional institutions.
Exactly. The informal controls that neighbors exert on each other weaken, which leaves individuals less constrained.
Makes sense.
Then, in 1951, Albert Reiss offered one of the earliest attempts to formalize these ideas, making a distinction between personal and social control.
Personal control sounds like something happening inside the individual. Self-control, basically.
It is, yeah. Reiss defined personal control as the internalization of norms from primary groups like the family leading to self-controlled behavior. Social control, by contrast, was the ability of groups and institutions to enforce rules, which results in compliance out of submission rather than internal belief.
And his research showed which was more important. Did he find a difference?
In his study of probationers, Reiss found that personal controls were more significant than social controls in predicting whether someone would reoffend.
Interesting.
This led him to focus on the failure of primary groups, particularly the family, to adequately instill non-delinquent values. He didn't detail how those controls worked precisely, but his logic was clear. Delinquency occurs when controls are insufficient, not because of some unique deviant motivation.
Okay, so the family's role in internalizing those initial controls was key for Reiss. Then in 1957, Jackson Toby brought in a concept that feels very intuitive. Stakes in conformity.
This is a great example of bridging the control idea with a touch of rational calculation, even if not explicitly stated that way initially. Toby argued that adolescents without commitment to conventional society, those lacking stakes in conformity, were prime candidates for gang socialization.
Stakes. Like what you have to lose, that kind of thing.
Exactly. He meant the investments individuals have made in conventional life, doing well in school, maintaining positive family relationships, thinking about future job or career prospects. These are things that could be jeopardized or lost if you engage in delinquency.
So if you've invested heavily in those conventional paths, you have high stakes, and the potential loss acts as a powerful restraint.
Right.
If you haven't invested much, maybe you're doing poorly in school, feel disconnected from your family, don't see a clear future, you have low stakes, very little to lose.
Right. You're effectively free to pursue alternative paths, including associating with delinquent groups and engaging in deviance because the cost-benefit calculation is different.
Right, the downside isn't as big for you.
Exactly. This simple but potent idea about having something to lose directly foreshadowed concepts in later, more systematic control theories.
And speaking of systematic, Ivan Nye in 1958 really took a structured look at the family, calling it the most crucial control mechanism because of the affectional bonds forged there.
Nye was significant for attempting to break down how control operates within the family. He identified 4 distinct modes of social control originating from family dynamics.
Let's go through those. The first, direct control. Sounds obvious.
This is the most visible form. External constraints imposed by parents, teachers, or even law enforcement. It's about rules, supervision, and punishment. Grounding kids, that sort of thing.
Okay. Then, internalized control.
This is similar to Reiss's personal control, the individual's self-regulation, having absorbed norms and values to the point where they guide behavior even without external supervision. Your conscience, perhaps.
Right. Third, indirect control.
This is driven by affection and respect for significant others who are conventional. You conform not just because you've internalized the rule, but because you don't want to disappoint or hurt people you care about and whose good opinion you value, like not wanting to let your parents down.
Okay. That makes sense. And finally, control through alternative means.
This involves providing legitimate ways for young people to satisfy their needs and desires. If you offer opportunities for achievement, excitement, or belonging through conventional channels like sports teams, clubs, or engaging family activities, it reduces the temptation to seek those satisfactions through illegitimate, delinquent means.
Keep him busy with good stuff, basically.
Pretty much. Nye saw these four modes as independent but reinforcing each other, working best when they were all present and strong.
And his focus on family control was a significant counterpoint to theories at the time that highlighted economic factors as the primary cause of crime.
Yes, definitely. While acknowledging that some delinquency might stem from learning deviant behavior when controls are weak, Nye's core position was clear. Most delinquent behavior is the result of insufficient social control. It's interesting that Hirschi later critiqued Nye's idea of internal control, but then, with Gottfredson, developed the concept of self-control, showing the evolution of these ideas. Nye's work represented the first substantial research effort from this perspective, and his findings linking family control to delinquency held up in later studies.
Moving forward to 1967, Walter Reckless presented his containment theory, asking that fundamental question. Why do most people resist the various pushes and pulls towards crime?
Right. Reckless identified internal push factors like restlessness, aggression, or impulsivity, and external pull factors such as poverty, media portrayals of crime, or delinquent companions. His answer to resisting these forces was containment factors that act as insulators or buffers.
He split these into outer and inner containment. What's outer?
Outer containment refers to the external environment. Having reasonable limits and expectations placed upon you, finding meaningful roles and activities, experiencing a sense of belonging, having supportive relationships, especially in the family, and receiving adequate discipline. These are the external structures that hold you in check, like a good community, strong family rules.
And inner containment. He thought this was more important.
Reckless considered inner containment more important because he felt it could guide behavior regardless of changes in the external environment. This includes a strong and favorable self-concept, a clear orientation towards legitimate goals, the ability to tolerate frustration, and crucially, norm retention, actively accepting and being committed to conventional norms and values.
Norm retention.
Yeah.
So holding on to those values. And he described norm erosion as the process where that retention weakens.
Yes, where individuals start to feel alienated from conventional norms, withdraw their legitimacy from them, or learn techniques to neutralize their ethical force. This idea of norm erosion connects back to David Motz's drift theory from the 1960s.
Motz's idea was that delinquents weren't necessarily committed criminals, but more like drifters, flitting between worlds.
Exactly. Motza argued that most delinquents aren't compelled towards crime by deep-seated pathology or subcultural values. They're only partially receptive to conventional norms, existing in a state of drift, flirting with both conventional and delinquent worlds. Those with few stakes in conformity, much like Toby's idea, were freer to drift in and out of delinquency because the controls were weaker. Reckless's idea of norm erosion and Motz's concept of neutralization provide mechanisms for how internal controls can weaken or be temporarily suspended.
Makes sense. Finally, before Hirschi's major statement, Breyer and Pillivan in 1965 directly challenged the prevailing theories of the 1960s, particularly those focused on deviant subcultures or status frustration.
Yeah, they looked at delinquency not through the lens of deep-seated motivation, but emphasized temporary situational triggers.
Situational factors again.
They argued that motivation alone didn't significantly distinguish delinquents from non-delinquents. What mattered more were variable commitments to conformity.
Which sounds very familiar now after discussing Toby and Reckless. Almost the same idea as stakes.
It does. Very similar. They defined commitments to conformity as the fear of losing something valued material possessions, positive self-image, valued relationships, or current future social statuses. Their research found that these variable commitments were key. If you had less to lose, you were more likely to engage in deviance when a situational opportunity or provocation arose. This concept significantly influenced Hirschi.
And that brings us to the most impactful contribution in this area. Travis Hirschi's 1969 social bond theory. His assertion is direct and widely cited. Delinquent acts result when an individual's bond to society is weak or broken.
This really became the central statement of sociological control theory for decades. Hirschi identified 4 key elements of this social bond, which he saw not as deep psychological states, but as more superficial connections to conventional society that could change over time.
Let's break down his 4 elements. First, attachment. What's that?
This is the emotional connection we have to conventional people and institutions. Our parents, teachers, friends who aren't involved in crime, school itself. If you have strong attachments, you care about their opinions of you, and that concern acts as a restraint, making you less likely to do things that would risk those relationships or earn their disapproval.
So it's about the people you care about, not just the rules themselves, like Nye's indirect control.
Very similar idea, yes. It's about valuing others' feelings, not necessarily internalizing abstract rules. Second, commitment.
This is Toby's stakes in conformity, right?
Exactly. Hirschi defined commitment as the investment an individual has made in conventional activities or institutions that they could lose through deviance.
Like investing time and effort in getting an education or building a career, putting in the work.
Yes. Think of it like putting chips on the table in a game. The more chips you've put in, the more invested you are in your education, your job, your reputation, your future goals, the higher your stake in conformity. The more you have to lose, the less likely you are to risk it all for a potentially temporary gain from crime.
That's a clear nod to that rational actor idea within his sociological model. Cost-benefit.
Definitely. Third, involvement. This one seems almost deceptively simple.
Yeah, just being busy.
It is. It's the straightforward idea that being heavily involved and busy with conventional legitimate activities, schoolwork, sports, clubs, hobbies, part-time jobs, simply leaves less time, energy, and opportunity for engaging in delinquent behavior. Idle hands, as the saying goes.
Find mischief. Okay, simple but logical. And the fourth element, beliefs.
Hirschi viewed beliefs not as deeply internalized moral codes, but more as a level of acceptance of conventional norms and laws. He argued that these beliefs are closely tied to and dependent on the other elements of the bond, particularly attachment.
How so?
You're more likely to believe that laws are fair and should be followed if you're attached to people and institutions that hold those beliefs. If your bonds weaken, your belief in the legitimacy of the rules is likely to weaken too. It's not some abstract moral philosophy, it's tied to your connections.
Okay, so attachment, commitment, involvement, and beliefs. These four elements, though distinct, are interrelated and work together to create a bond that prevents people from breaking the law. The stronger the bond, the less likely deviance is.
That's the core idea, and a major reason for the influence of Hirschi's 1969 theory, as noted in the source, was its strong empirical support. He conducted a significant, large-scale study of over 4,000 adolescents with diverse backgrounds, specifically to test his control theory against prevailing strain and cultural diversity theories.
And his findings were compelling. What did he find?
They strongly supported the variables linked to social bonds. He found that adolescents with stronger relationships and attachments to their parents were less likely to engage in delinquency. Similarly, disliking school, doing poorly academically, or not caring what teachers thought was consistently linked to higher rates of delinquency.
That seems intuitive enough. Ties to family and school matter. But he had a finding about peers that was less intuitive at the time, right? Challenged existing ideas.
This was a crucial point that challenged differential association theory. Hirschi's data suggested that it wasn't that having delinquent friends caused you to become delinquent by teaching you criminal skills or attitudes.
Which is what differential association would argue.
Exactly. Instead, Hirschi argued, it was having weak social bonds and a low stake in conformity that led individuals to seek out and acquire delinquent friends in the first place. You drift towards those who share your low level of constraint. Birds of a feather flock together, but the weak bond comes first.
So who you hang out with is a result of your weak bond, not the cause of it. That's a significant reframing.
It really was. His study also found that high aspirations were linked to less delinquency because they represented a commitment and a stake in conformity, which contradicted the strain theory idea that unfulfilled aspirations lead to crime.
Right. Strain says high goals plus blocked means crime. Hirschi says high goals, something to lose, less crime.
Precisely. And interestingly, social class and ethnic background showed only a very weak relationship with offending in his data, suggesting individual bonds were more powerful predictors than broad social categories, at least in that study.
Has subsequent research backed up Hirschi's findings on bonds?
Yes. Generally, the links between family and school bonds and commitments and delinquency have been consistently supported in follow-up research. Strong family attachment means less delinquency. Poor school performance, disliking school, and low aspirations remain strongly linked to higher delinquency.
But what about the peers thing? Is that settled?
Well, some studies, like one by Thompson, Mitchell, and Dodler mentioned in the source, did find that including delinquent peers added explanatory power, and sometimes findings lean back towards social learning interpretations alongside control. So the relationship between bonds and peers is still a topic of discussion. It's probably interactive, but the core idea of weak bonds mattering holds up.
Okay. Even with that empirical strength, Hirschi's 1969 theory wasn't without its criticisms, of course.
No theory is. Hirschi himself later admitted he might have overestimated the importance of involvement, just being busy isn't everything, and underestimated the influence of delinquent friends, as we just discussed. He saw both of these as stemming from his initial assumption that motivation towards offending was natural and didn't need much explaining.
What were some other criticisms? What does it not explain well?
A significant one is that while it explains why someone might be freer to offend because their bonds are weak, it doesn't really explain the specific type or content of that offending behavior.
Right. Why burglary versus assault versus fraud?
Exactly. Why does one person with weak bonds become a burglar, another a drug user, another a vandal, or even a corporate criminal? The theory doesn't differentiate.
Yeah.
It also doesn't fully account for the underlying structural or historical context that might weaken bonds for entire groups of people, and it primarily focuses on primary deviance, the initial act, rather than explaining why someone might continue offending and develop a persistent criminal identity, secondary deviance.
Well, it's strong on explaining who is less constrained, but less strong on what crime they will commit or why they keep doing it. It doesn't explain the patterns of crime very well.
Precisely. These limitations led some researchers to feel that control theory, while powerful, needed to be combined with other perspectives to offer a more complete picture.
That makes sense. You want to integrate the strength of control theory with insights from other areas. So let's look at some of these attempts at integration. First, Eliot, Ageton, and Cantor in 1979. What was their goal?
They explicitly set out to expand and synthesize existing theories, specifically bringing together ideas from anatomy, social learning, and control, a triple threat.
How did they weave those together? Sounds complicated.
Their model starts with the idea that variable socialization early in life leads to initially strong or weak social bonds. Classic control starting point.
Yeah.
But these bonds aren't fixed. They are then reinforced or weakened by subsequent life experiences, things like success or failure in school, the stability of your community and home life, or whether you experienced negative labeling.
So life events can strengthen or weaken your bonds over time. And they also brought in structure more explicitly than Hirschi did initially.
Yes, this was key. They argued that structural factors play a direct role in loosening those bonds. Things like blocked opportunities in education or the job market, negative labeling practices within institutions like being streamed into lower academic tracks, social disorganization in your neighborhood or home, and broader economic issues like recession or unemployment. These experiences can weaken an individual's ties to the conventional order.
So structure impacts bonds. How does motivation fit in their integrated model? Does it come back in?
It does. Through strain, they argued that structural impediments can cause strain, creating a motivational stimulus, but only if the individual still holds strong conventional goals.
So strain matters if you still care about the goals.
Right. If bonds and commitments are already weak, you might need something else to provide motivation or direction for your deviance.
And that something else comes from social learning from peers.
Exactly. They brought in social learning theory, suggesting that access to and involvement in delinquent learning structures, associating with deviant peers, learning techniques, attitudes, and justifications for crime, provides that further positive motivation and shapes the specific form that delinquent behavior takes.
So in their model, there are two main pathways to delinquency, like different routes.
Yes. The first, which they thought was probably most frequent, combines control and social learning. You start with weak conventional bonds, and then you are exposed to and become committed to delinquent groups.
Okay, weak bonds plus bad influences.
Pretty much. The second pathway combines strain and social learning. You might start with relatively strong bonds, but you experience strain from blocked opportunities or other structural impediments, and then you are exposed to and become committed to delinquent groups.
Strong bonds plus strain plus bad influences.
Right. It's a more complex model that tries to show how individual connections and learning interact with broader social forces.
Another significant attempt at integration came from Stephen Box in the UK in the 1980s, in his books from 1981 and 1987. His starting point was trying to explain that gap. The difference between self-report crime and official statistics, particularly regarding class.
Right. The paradox that self-report studies showed only a weak link between social class and crime, while official crime statistics showed a strong link, with people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds appearing disproportionately in the system.
So how did he try to bridge that gap?
Box integrated control theory with insights from labeling and conflict theory, drawing on what's sometimes called the victimized actor model. His goal was to explain how people who commit primary deviance, minor offenses often caught in self-report studies across classes, end up becoming secondary deviants, labeled, processed, and officially counted, and how this process is biased.
So it's about how individuals move from committing an act to acquiring a criminal label and identity within the system. The system's reaction matters.
Precisely. Box argued that differential policing and institutional biases throughout the criminal justice system systematically favor the economically advantaged and disadvantage those from less favored groups, the economically marginalized minority groups.
But he took a broader view too, right? Not just individual cops being biased.
Yes, he took a macro historical view, suggesting this isn't just individual bias on the part of police or judges, but an outcome that reflects societal responses to broader social problems.
Like seeing the economically marginalized as symbolizing a threat, especially during tough economic times.
Yes. He suggested that in times of economic change or uncertainty, the economically marginalized can come to symbolize a perceived threat, perhaps the growth of a permanently unemployed class, and are therefore treated more harshly by the system. It becomes a way of managing social anxiety about those groups.
And he saw this process as interactive. Getting caught makes things worse.
Absolutely. Box argued that experiencing the stigma, the disadvantage, and the perceived injustice of being unfairly criminalized provides further impetus for individuals to engage in criminal behavior. It weakens their remaining ties to conventional society and might even motivate them to act against a system they see as unjust.
That makes sense. If the system screws you over, why play by its rules?
Exactly. He used the UK recession of the 1980s as an example, arguing that the recession both increased strain, reduced opportunities, increased deprivation, and undermined family stability and employment, reducing the ability or motivation to form attachments to controlling influences. So, fewer stakes and more reason to be angry.
So Box really tried to pull control theory out of just blaming individuals or families and link it explicitly to the power dynamics and structural inequalities within society. Very critical perspective.
That was a key goal, yeah. Similarly, John Braithwaite in 1989 offered another significant attempt to build upon and integrate control theory, along with labeling, strain, and subcultural theories, specifically focusing on explaining predatory crime.
His central concept is reintegrative shaming. Sounds less harsh than just shaming.
Braithwaite argued that the key to controlling crime lies in a society's cultural commitment to reintegrative shaming. His core statement was, societies with low crime rates are those that shame potently and judiciously.
What's the difference between good shaming and bad shaming, in his view? Shaming usually sounds bad.
He made a crucial distinction. Stigmatizing shaming is what happens when the shaming process leads to the individual being outcast or ostracized. It confirms a deviant identity and locks them into a master status as a criminal. Think ex-con label.
Okay, pushing them away.
Braithwaite argued that this type of shaming pushes offenders towards criminal subcultures because those subcultures offer a place of belonging, support, deviant role models, and access to techniques to neutralize conventional norms, like Matza described.
So stigmatization creates the conditions for criminal subcultures to flourish. They become the only group that accepts you.
Exactly. Reintegrative shaming, on the other hand, is potent. It clearly expresses disapproval of the act, but it maintains bonds of respect and love for the individual, and the disapproval is sharply terminated with forgiveness.
So hate the sin, love the sinner, basically, and then bring them back in.
Pretty much, yeah. It shames the act while maintaining bonds of respect, love, sharply terminating disapproval with forgiveness, controls crime by reinforcing bonds rather than breaking them.
So criminal subcultures are attractive to those who have been stigmatized because they offer an alternative community.
Yes, and high levels of stigmatization at a societal level actually stimulate the formation of these subcultures. Braithwaite also linked this dynamic to structural factors, arguing that systematic blockage of legitimate opportunities in society also encourages this negative configuration of stigmatization, leading to subcultures.
So it's shaming plus blocked opportunities that drives people to deviant groups.
That's the connection he makes. And who is most responsive to this reintegrative shaming?
Good question. Who listens?
Individuals who are enmeshed in multiple relationships of interdependency. In other words, people who have lots of social connections and things to lose from disapproval. People with strong bonds, essentially.
Okay. And societally.
Braithwaite suggested that societies that are more communitarian, characterized by dense social networks, mutual help, and trust, are better equipped to deliver this potent and reintegrative form of shaming compared to more individualistic societies.
Makes sense. It's easier to reintegrate someone if there's a strong community to reintegrate them into.
Right. Like Box, Braithwaite seemed focused on moving the conversation beyond just individual failures.
Absolutely. He also sought to rescue control theory from simply blaming individuals or families and connecting it to broader societal processes and structures, aligning, as the source notes, with a victimized actor perspective. The source even mentions his theory being central to a populist socialist perspective because of its focus on community and structural factors influencing crime control. He acknowledges, though, that it doesn't explain all crime.
Fair enough. No theory does. These integrated theories offer richer explanations by combining different layers. But Hirschi, along with Michael Gottfredson, took a different approach in 1990, making a bolder claim.
They certainly did. Their work, A General Theory of Crime, made the ambitious claim that it could explain all crime at all times.
A general theory is the holy grail for some. Very ambitious.
How did they approach this? How did they try to build this one theory to rule them all?
They integrated a rational actor definition of crime with a predestined actor explanation for criminality.
Okay, how do they define crime in this theory? Still based on self-interest.
Following the rational actor tradition, yes, they define crime as acts of force or fraud undertaken in pursuit of self-interest. But their characterization was quite specific. They described these acts as typically trivial, mundane, requiring little effort or skill.
Trivial and mundane, really, seems dismissive.
It does. And importantly, versatile, meaning different types of crime, are essentially interchangeable. This goes against ideas of criminal specialization or individuals having distinct criminal careers. They also noted that the likelihood of crime, given the propensity, still depends on opportunity.
Okay, so crime itself is seen as simple and opportunistic.
Yeah.
What was their explanation for criminality, the propensity to commit crime, the core cause?
Low self-control.
Just that, low self-control.
They define this as an enduring propensity, a stable trait, and they linked it not just to crime, but also to a range of analogous acts, behaviors like promiscuity, smoking, heavy drinking, gambling, risky driving, all seen as impulsive behaviors seeking immediate gratification.
So the same underlying thing causes crime and, say, speeding.
That's the argument. And what caused this low self-control?
Where does it come from?
Their theory squarely placed the blame on ineffective parenting. Specifically, the failure to monitor children's behavior, recognize deviant behavior when it occurs, and punish it appropriately and consistently early in life. Before age 8 or 10, they suggested.
Wow. Puts a lot on parents in those early years, which links directly to their stability postulate.
Yes. They argued that once established, whether high or low, self-control levels are remarkably stable throughout the life course. As they put it, differences between people in the likelihood that they will commit criminal acts persist over time. The patterns set in early childhood are hard to change later.
So how did this general theory relate to Hirschi's earlier 1969 theory? Was it an update or something new?
They presented it as a radical restatement. It addressed some of the criticisms of the original theory and shifted towards a more explicitly rational actor view of crime itself.
How did it address criticisms?
By claiming that crime is versatile and low self-control is stable, they argued they didn't need separate explanations for different kinds of crime or for why people persist, secondary deviance. It was all down to that one stable propensity. Simplified things massively.
And they made a crucial change regarding the social bonds from the 1969 theory. This seems really important.
This is a key point of divergence, yes. Unlike the 1969 theory where bonds were somewhat independent factors preventing crime.
Right, attachment, commitment, etc. stopped you.
In the general theory, the types of social bonds in individual forms are seen as a consequence or function of their level of self-control.
Wait, so bonds don't cause conformity anymore?
Not directly. If you have high self-control, you are capable of forming and maintaining those constraining relationships and commitments. If you have low self-control, you are impulsive, avoid planning, prefer immediate gratification, and are therefore less likely or able to develop strong attachments, commitments, or beliefs in conventional institutions. The social bonds are seen as a result of self-control, not a primary cause of conformity.
That's a pretty fundamental shift. Bonds went from being the cause of conformity to being an effect of something deeper, this self-control trait.
Exactly. And this allowed them to largely reject the importance of sociological variables like social class, race, or neighborhood characteristics as direct causes of crime. The primary cause is individual self-control rooted in early parenting. Everything else is downstream from that.
As you might expect from such a bold claim, the general theory faced significant criticisms. People must have pushed back hard.
Oh, absolutely. One of the most common and powerful critiques revolves around its ability to explain white-collar and corporate crime.
Because that type of crime doesn't seem to fit the description of trivial, unplanned, or requiring little skill. It often seems the opposite.
Precisely. As critics like Barlow have pointed out, high-level corporate fraud often involves complex planning, specialized expertise, organizational structures, delayed gratification, schemes can take years, persistence, and yield very large gains. This directly contradicts Gottfredson and Hirschi's characterization of crime as mundane and requiring little effort or skill.
Yeah, running a long-term embezzlement scheme seems to require a lot of planning and, dare I say, self-control in some ways.
Right. And this also challenges the stability postulate, doesn't it?
How so?
It does. If low self-control prevents discipline, planning, and effort, how do corporate offenders, who presumably had enough self-control to climb organizational ladders and execute complex schemes, engage in such behavior?
Good point.
This suggests either that self-control isn't as perfectly stable as the theory claims, or that low self-control isn't the only factor explaining all types of crime, or perhaps that the definition of low self-control itself needs to be broadened to include different manifestations in different contexts. Maybe it's about what you control yourself for.
And the simple link between low self-control and parenting has also been questioned, right?
Yeah.
Seems too neat.
Yes. While parenting is undoubtedly important, critics argue it's too simplistic to isolate it as the sole cause of low self-control without considering the context in which parenting occurs. Harriet Wilson's study, mentioned in the source, provided evidence that what appears as lax parenting is often closely linked to severe social disadvantages experienced by families, high unemployment, poverty, chronic stress.
So it's hard to parent effectively when you're under immense pressure yourself.
Exactly. She argued that it's the position of the most disadvantaged groups in society and the stresses they face that needs improvement, not just blaming individual parents in isolation. The structural context is incredibly difficult to ignore entirely.
So even when they tried to make self-control the primary internal mechanism, the external social environment seems to creep back in as a necessary consideration. You can't fully escape structure.
It's hard to build a truly general theory that completely divorces individual propensity from social context. Despite these criticisms, the general theory remains influential. Hirschi, in 1995, outlined its implications for policy.
Given his view, he wasn't a fan of deterrence or rehabilitation policies. What did he suggest instead?
No, he viewed them as largely ineffective because self-control is set early. Based on the theory, the most effective policies should focus on supporting and enhancing family socialization, specifically aiming to improve the quality of child rearing early in life by focusing on the form, size, and stability of the family unit.
And he even suggested specific, potentially controversial examples, like what?
Yes, the source notes his examples included supporting structures like having 2 parents per child, limiting family size to no more than 3 children, and fostering strong, durable bonds within the family. He emphasized the importance of father involvement, arguing the issue isn't teenage pregnancy itself, but the lack of a father figure.
Wow, that's very specific and prescriptive.
It is. Policies, in this view, should focus on strengthening these family dynamics to instill greater self-control in children, thereby preventing future offending.
Okay, so despite the general theory's sweeping claims and its attempt to move away from sociological factors, developments in social control theory didn't stop in 1990. Researchers continued to modify and extend these ideas. It wasn't the final word.
Exactly. The source highlights several notable recent developments that built on the control tradition, often incorporating other variables, refusing to let go of social context entirely.
Let's look at power control theory by John Hagen and his colleagues. What was their specific focus? Sounds like it brings power back in.
Their primary goal was to explain gender differences in crime by integrating social class and control theories.
Ah, the gender gap in crime.
Yeah.
That's a persistent finding.
Right. Their core argument was that the power dynamics parents experience in the workplace influence the levels of patriarchal attitudes they bring into the home, and this, in turn, leads to different levels of control being placed on sons versus daughters, which ultimately affects their attitudes towards risk-taking and deviance.
How does that manifest in different household structures? So work life affects home life control.
In balanced households, where both parents have similar levels of power and authority in their jobs, mothers, who are often still seen as primary socializers, though the theory can apply to both parents, are less likely to impose differential controls on their daughters compared to their sons.
So more equal parents means more equal control of kids.
Essentially, yes. Both boys and girls in these homes experience similar levels of control and develop similar attitudes towards risks and benefits of deviance, resulting in fewer gender differences in offending rates.
And in less balanced households, more traditional ones.
In unbalanced or patriarchal households where there's a significant difference in parental power, historically father-dominant, parents, again, particularly mothers as primary socializers, place greater control and supervision on daughters. Be a lady, stay close to home.
Right.
Daughters in these homes develop more unfavorable attitudes towards deviance. They perceive higher risks and fewer potential benefits. This leads to significant gender differences, with boys in these patriarchal homes being much more likely to engage in delinquency than their sisters, who are more tightly controlled.
So the theory suggests that as gender equality in the workplace increases, the control mechanisms at home become more similar for boys and girls, leading to a convergence in delinquency rates. Is that what we see?
That's part of the implication, and there's some support. Research has largely supported the idea that girls are differentially controlled and that female offending is linked to the level of patriarchy experienced. Interestingly, in less patriarchal homes, sons also tend to experience more controls than sons in patriarchal homes, which also contributes to lower delinquency rates overall in those environments.
Moving to another recent development, Charles Tittle's control balance theory takes a much broader view, not just crime.
Yes, Tittle aimed for a general theory of deviant behavior, not just criminality. He used a wider definition of deviance to include any act disapproved of by the majority, linking to the concept of social harms or semiology.
And his core concept is control imbalance. What does that mean?
Tittle argues that deviance occurs because of an imbalance in the amount of control an individual experiences relative to the amount of control they can exert over others or their environment. This can be either a control surplus or a control deficit, too much control or too little.
Okay, what does a control surplus look like? Having too much power.
This is when an individual can exert more control than is exerted over them. This situation, Tittle argues, can lead to forms of deviancy aimed at extending that control or enhancing autonomy through exploitation or indifference to others. Think of corruption or actions intended to increase one's power and dominance.
Like corporate bosses exploiting workers.
That could be an example, yes. The link to crime here is that the power imbalance means others are subservient, effectively removing the risk of being challenged or caught. This type of imbalance is seen as potentially explaining corporate crime.
And a control deficit, being controlled too much.
This is the opposite. When you are controlled more than you can control others, this situation can lead to feelings of resentment, envy, powerlessness, and a loss of stake in society, removing the incentive to conform.
Right.
Tittle links this to deviancy aimed at alleviating the deficit, perhaps through unpredictable or destructive acts. The link to crime is that the breakdown of subservience or feeling overly controlled can provoke anger or desperation. This can potentially explain street crime or interpersonal violence like domestic violence.
So, whether you have too much control or too little, the imbalance itself is a driver for deviance. It's destabilizing either way.
Yes, Tittle argues the fundamental motivation stemming from imbalance is the desire to gain or maintain autonomy. A surplus drives a desire to extend control, rooted in perceived greed. A deficit drives a desire to alleviate the deficit, rooted in perceived need. However, he still maintains that for deviance to occur, there must be a provocation, an opportunity, and an absence of constraint. It's not automatic.
How does Tittle explain gender differences in deviance using this?
He argues that historically, women have more often experienced control deficits due to societal structures. This might manifest in forms of submissive deviancy, but also limits their access to opportunities for predatory crimes. Fewer women have historically been in positions with control surpluses, explaining their underrepresentation in crimes of exploitation or plunder compared to men.
Interesting. So structure creates different imbalances for men and women.
Right. The source notes Braithwaite in 1997 suggested a policy implication here. Reducing deviance might require redistributing control imbalances towards a more egalitarian society.
Finally, Mark Colvin's Differential Coercion Theory focuses specifically on the role of coercion, being forced or pressured.
Colvin's theory extends the understanding of the link between experiencing coercion and engaging in crime. While other theories touched on it, he made it central, proposing that criminal involvement is directly related to the degree of duress and individual experiences.
And where does this coercion come from? Just parents?
From multiple sources: families, schools, peer groups, and neighborhoods. It's differential because individuals are exposed to varying levels and types of coercion. Colvin identified two key dimensions: the degree of coercion, how strong, and the consistency, how often it occurs. He argued that in typical everyday life where coercion can be inconsistent, the degree is the more significant factor.
What's the mechanism linking coercion to crime? How does being coerced make you more likely to offend?
Colvin argues that chronic or intense coercion produces social psychological deficits.
Deficits? Like,
The more coercion experienced, the higher the individual's levels of anger and resentment, the lower their self-control, the weaker their social bonds, and the more likely they are to develop coercive ideation.
what is coercive ideation? That sounds like jargon.
It's basically a worldview or cognitive schema where the individual perceives their environment as being filled with coercive forces that can only be overcome by using coercion oneself. You learn that power and force are how the world works, so you adopt that approach.
Ah, okay. Fight fire with fire.
Kind of. These psychological deficits, developed through exposure to coercion, are what mediate the link between the coercion itself and delinquency.
He also distinguished between interpersonal and impersonal coercion, right? Direct versus indirect pressure.
Yes. Interpersonal coercion is direct. Micro-level coercion occurring in relationships, such as the use or threat of force, intimidation, or withdrawal of social support within the family. Impersonal coercion is macro-level pressure from larger circumstances that individuals experience as threatening,
Like what?
like high unemployment, poverty, exposure to group violence in a neighborhood, or feeling unsafe in a school environment due to pervasive bullying. Decker and Van Winkle's work on gang rivalries creating a threatening neighborhood environment is cited as an example of this.
So accumulated exposure to these different forms of coercion leads to psychological deficits that increase the likelihood of delinquency. It builds up.
That's the core logic. Colvin suggests this framework can apply to most forms of criminality, including white-collar crime, by looking at the coercive environments within organizations. A study by Unnever, Colvin, and Cullen in 2004, mentioned in the source, looked at middle schoolers and provided empirical support for the theory, finding that different types of coercion were associated with delinquency, with parental coercion showing the strongest link in that specific study. School and neighborhood coercion were also linked, though peer coercion was not in that instance.
Wow. That covers a huge range of theoretical ground, from ancient philosophy to modern attempts to integrate structure and psychology. So as we wrap up this whole exploration, what are the big, lasting impressions of social control theory? Its main takeaway.
Well, its popularity and influence are undeniable, especially Hirschi's original 1969 theory. It was testable, empirically supported, and its focus on individual bonds rather than broad structural issues made it appealing to certain political perspectives and funding sources that preferred explanations not centered on societal inequality. It's easier to fund programs focusing on families than ones trying to fix systemic poverty.
True. But there's still that fundamental debate, isn't there? Is it truly addressing the same problem as theories focus on motivation? Is it asking the right question?
That's right. As Downs and Rock have argued, rival theories like strain or subcultural perspectives try to explain the character and motivation of offending, why specific groups commit specific types of crime, or why individuals feel compelled towards deviance. Social control theory, by assuming motivation is natural gratification seeking that just needs restraint, runs into what you might call a blind spot.
The blind spot, what does it miss?
Yes. By defining motivation essentially out of existence, or just assuming its basic self-interest, it struggles to explain why deviance takes the specific, often non-utilitarian, ritualized, or complex forms it does.
Like graffiti or expressive violence.
Exactly. Why do some people engage in vandalism that serves no apparent purpose, or ritualize gang violence or complex sexual behaviors? Simply saying controls were weak doesn't fully explain the nature of the act. As Downs and Rock put it, in focusing so intently on conformity as the puzzle and deviance as the default, it makes far too little of both deviance and conformity. It doesn't delve deeply enough into the varied forms of either.
But its contribution remains significant, despite that.
Undeniably. Its major impact was forcing criminology to look at the other side of the coin to ask the overlooked question. Why do people conform? It redirected focus to the bonds, the commitments, the processes that maintain social order for the majority, rather than solely dissecting the deviance of the minority.
And while Gottfredson and Hirschi's claim of a truly general theory might not hold up perfectly, especially when confronted with complex crimes or the stability postulate without considering social context.
The more recent developments we discussed, power control, control balance, differential coercion, show that the theoretical work in this area is far from finished. They've been invaluable in attempting to extend the explanatory power of control theory by integrating it with other factors like gender, power dynamics, and coercion, even if none have provided a single, comprehensive explanation for every possible form of deviancy.
It feels like the most valuable insights come when control theory acknowledges that individual bonds and experiences of control operate within and are shaped by broader social structures and power relations. You can't ignore the context.
That seems to be the trajectory of the theory's evolution in recent decades, moving towards more integrated models.
This has been a deep dive into a truly fundamental way of rethinking the very nature of crime and conformity. A great way to end the season.
It definitely challenges us to see the invisible threads that connect us and, keep society together, more or less.
And if this has piqued your interest and you want to explore these ideas further, the source material, Hopkins Burke's book, points to some key texts.
Yeah, for the core U.S. perspective, you'd start with Hirschi's 1969 book, Causes of Delinquency, and Gottfredson and Hirschi's 1990, A General Theory of Crime. For a look at the UK context and early empirical work, Harriet Wilson's 1980 study is relevant.
If you're interested in the integrated theories we talked about, check out Box, 1981, 1987, Elliott, Asiaton, and Cantor, 1979, and Braithwaite, 1989, on reintegrative shaming.
For specific applications, Heidenson's 1985 work on women and crime from a control perspective is important.
And for the more recent developments, Hagen, Gillis, and Simpson, 1985, for power control theory, Title 2000, for control balance theory, and Colvin, 2000, for differential coercion theory.
That gives you a solid reading list if you want to go even deeper into the world of social control. Lots to chew on there.
It truly highlights how one simple question, why do most people conform, can unravel into such a rich and complex landscape of theoretical debate and empirical research. And that brings us to the end of this deep dive, wrapping up our journey through Roger Hopkins Burke's An Introduction to Criminological Theory. We've traversed classical ideas, biological perspectives, social structure, subcultures, labeling, and now social control. Quite a tour.
It's a powerful reminder that understanding the complex phenomenon of crime requires looking through multiple lenses and being willing to question our most basic assumptions about human behavior and social order. There's no single easy answer.
Indeed. And social control theory leaves us with that enduring paradox. It's not just about the forces that might push a few individuals towards breaking the rules, but about the often invisible bonds, commitments, and constraints that tether the vast majority of us to conformity, day in and day out. It's a potent reminder that social order is actively maintained. It doesn't just happen.
It makes you see your own life a little differently, perhaps. Why you do what you do.
It does. So let's leave you, the listener, with this thought to consider as we finish. What are your own stakes in conformity? What are the bonds, commitments, and beliefs? Your relationships, your job, your education, your future plans, your personal values, your daily routines that keep you aligned with conventional norms. And how might changes in those personal controls or changes in your exposure to different forms of coercion or imbalance in control potentially impact your own behavior? It invites a moment of self-reflection on the subtle, powerful forces shaping your everyday choices.